So, Peter, you've called modern psychiatry a disaster. What do you mean by that?
Well, the brief version is that the way people use psychiatric drugs definitely cause much more harm than benefit. And 10 years ago, I wrote an article where I concluded that doctors are unable to handle psychiatric drugs prudently. So it would be better if we didn't have them, if we took them all off the market. Of course, psychiatric drugs can be useful in acute situations. For example, if you need to get some rest and be calmed down, if you are very excited or very sad about something. But doctors often use psychiatric drugs for many years to the same patients, and that's definitely harmful.
Yeah. How can you explain the disconnect? Because, these drugs, they're approved by the FDA. You hear, from the majority of academic psychiatrists, these drugs are safe and effective. In fact, they need to be used more. We're underdiagnosing people. How can you bridge the gap between these two narratives? What people are hearing in the news and from the experts about them being safe and what you just said?
That's very simple, really. First of all, the mantra is that drugs are safe and effective. This is an impossibility. If a drug has benefits, it will always harm some people. So nothing can be both safe and effective. It's only a question about how frequent are the harms and how serious are they compared to the benefits. And then you need to balance these two outcomes. So that was the first thing. The other thing is that drug regulators like the FDA, they have no responsibility for how doctors use drugs once they have been approved. And if they had such a responsibility, they should not allow what they allow currently, because I have done estimations that our prescription drugs are the leading cause of death, ahead of heart disease and cancer. This will surprise many people, but I have published about this. And our psychiatric drugs, very surprisingly, are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. People don't realize this, and therefore we need to inform the general public about how the situation is.
Mm-hmm. And if I were to ask, so, you mentioned that the drugs, or you alluded to them being used irresponsibly. How so? Why are these medications, in your perspective, being used irresponsibly now?
Well, it's a funny question, Joseph, because you know very well the answer. Mm-hmm. It is far easier to prescribe a pill than to start psychotherapy. And you also earn much more money by prescribing pills, because it has been documented that sometimes doctors prescribe a psychiatric drug after a consultation lasting just 5 minutes. So you can prescribe many pills. And psychotherapy is better than pills in the long run. This has been documented. So we need to focus on helping people with the problems they have, in being human in our doctor-patient relationship, and not just handing them a pill. And then when you have done that, given them a pill, the problem is that if patients want to come off the pills again, perhaps because of the side effects, then quite few doctors, also quite few psychiatrists, know how to taper off the drugs relatively safely, very slowly and in a hyperbolic fashion, not by halving the dose every second week or so. But very slowly, when you come down to small doses, doctors don't know this, even though it is essentially a common clinical pharmacology knowledge that doctors should be aware about. And this is what you do in your practice. You help people taper off psychiatric drugs. So you know that it can be difficult. And if it is not done correctly, patients may get withdrawal symptoms that can sometimes be quite severe, and they can even resemble the condition they were treated for. For example, if you come off a antidepressant drug too quickly, you may develop what I have called an abstinence depression. And I call it that because it's not a true depression. If you have been on these drugs for a while and you are well, then the risk that you will deteriorate in just 1 week's time so much that you qualify for the criteria for a new depression, this is very unlikely for a particular patient. But in one study I have read, actually very many patients qualified for a depression diagnosis after having come off their drugs for up to only a week's time. So that's why I call them abstinence depressions. But few doctors are aware of this, and they interpret this as, well, you see, you still need the drug because you get depressed when you don't get it. This is like telling an alcoholic that tries to stop drinking, oh, you still need your alcohol because you're not well if you stop too quickly. That's very sad that doctors don't have this elementary knowledge.
And to touch on that part of it, one perspective someone could take from what you said is that, these doctors are almost villains in a way, that they know things should be done in a different way, but they are prescribing these medications because it's faster and there's more commercial benefit. Do you think doctors are really doing that, or are they just misinformed? Like, how much of it is really, bad morals and ethics, and how much of it is they don't know any better?
I don't see it as bad ethics. I just see it as something that happens naturally. It's so easy to give people a prescription and say, this drug will help you in some weeks, and go home and take it. It's so easy. Doctors are not evil or in any way. They just think they are helping their patients.
Why don't they know about the harms of these medications? Because, when I talk about this issue and when you talk about this issue, I mean, it seems very clear that, these medications, they are masking problems. And then on top of that, the effects are waning over time and leading to further complications. What's happening there? Why are so many doctors misinformed really about the safety of these medications and the usefulness of these medications long term?
The major issue is that placebo-controlled drug trials are virtually always organized by the drug industry, and they have no interest in documenting harms of drugs, and particularly not withdrawal effects when you try to come off the drugs again. So if you read clinical study reports published in medical journals, you will think that these drugs are more effective and less harmful than they really are. So doctors are misinformed because we allow the industry to be their own judges. We would not allow this in a court case, but this is what we allow in healthcare, and it doesn't make sense to me that we allow this. But there are sufficient data that should tell doctors about what these drugs really do to people. And then you can ask me, then why don't they act accordingly? And I think there are several explanations. First of all, they're exposed to a lot of propaganda from the drug industry, from drug salespeople and from conferences they go to. And secondly, they can't trust the published literature. Thirdly, the psychiatric organizations, for example, the American Psychiatric Organization, they prefer to trivialize harms of psychiatric drugs because somehow it benefits the profession to look the other way. This has been documented many times. For example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the United Kingdom, they refuse to accept that withdrawal effects after stopping antidepressant drugs are actually both quite common, and in many of the patients, they're also quite severe. So they launched the falsehood that, oh, they're pretty, they're nothing really to worry about, and after a couple of weeks, you'll be fine. This is totally and utterly wrong. So I was involved with several UK psychiatrists and psychologists and others writing to the Royal College of Psychiatrists, telling them, you must change this. And when they wouldn't, we involved the press. I think we involved the British Medical Journal and maybe the BBC, the TV station as well. So after having put quite some pressure on the college, they simply had to reverse their stance, which, when you talk about ethics before, I would call unethical. It was unethical. They must have known better because they even had an own survey they had done of patients where they could see that there are common and serious withdrawal problems which they had on their website. But as soon as we had complained to them, mysteriously, this survey disappeared. This is unethical.
Yeah. Now, I know you mentioned that there's, the pharmaceutical companies, they have an agenda and they are publishing controlled trial data that may skew the interpretation. The drugs seem more effective and safer than they are. I understand that. And then I also hear that you have organizations like the American Psychiatric Association, Royal College of Psychiatrists, which may also take a friendlier view towards medications because it benefits the profession and their standing. But what about academics? We have leading academics that are meant to be objective voices who are heading our institutions. We have medical journals with editors whose reputations are there to make sure that honest advice and objective advice is getting out to doctors. What is happening with these other checks and balances when it comes to the narrative about medications?
Unfortunately, our best medical journals are part of the problem. This summer, The Lancet published an anonymous editorial, maybe written by its editor-in-chief, Richard Horton, maybe by some other editor, I don't know. But it was about 50 years with SSRIs, the newer type of antidepressants. And it was supposed to be weighing the balance between benefits and harms. But that was not what the editorial was about. I wrote a highly critical article about this editorial, which was more or less praising the drugs. And it did not weigh the benefits and harms, and it quoted a seriously flawed meta-analysis published in the same journal in The Lancet by some psychiatrists some years ago that I and others have also criticized very heavily. So, and I have seen this in other major journals as well. So they are part of the problem. So it's actually very difficult, both for doctors and patients, to get honest, reliable information about what these drugs do to people. So we need to work together to get the messages out. And
why wouldn't a medical journal just simply publish, more honest perspectives on these medications? That seems like their job.
Well, why is it that both the British Medical Journal and the Lancet have published so-called state-of-the-art articles where you assume that here I will get the truth about these drugs?
Mm-hmm.
And then what I can read again and again is that they are far too uncritical. And for example, the risk of suicide with antidepressants, which has now been shown to be doubled, not only in children, but also in adults, by using FDA data. It's being trivialized in these articles, like, oh, you can safely take these drugs. And also, very often, they are described as highly effective, which is totally false, because in the studies that have been made of the effect of antidepressants is so small that it is far below what is clinically relevant. So an effect is not an effect if it doesn't matter, if it's only something you can detect statistically if you have very many patients. You need to have an effect that makes a difference to the patients. And this is not the case. But people ignore this again and again and again in these articles. I could turn the question to you. Do you have a better solution than this?
I think about the medical journals and the way they do. I mean, my understanding is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that with some medical journals, they don't want to rock the boat. You know, that there is an accepted narrative about these medications, which is accepted by their colleagues and the other leaders in the space. And they would be getting a lot of criticism from their peers if they were to publish a critical piece, particularly when it comes to psychiatric medications. The narrative about them, which in a large part has been constructed by, American Psychiatric Association and different academic voices who have been, let's say, platformed by drug company money, is that these drugs are safe, the case is closed. Anyone who criticizes them is actually a dangerous person. This is someone who is nefarious. They have outdated views about mental health. They think people ought to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so they're afraid to publish something like that because they feel like they're going to get negative media attention. Someone is going to say, oh, look at the BMJ or the Lancet or JAMA. They're publishing this dangerous article right now that is going to scare people away from the medications. I think they're worrying about their reputation in the press because they would be going against the grain. I also think, and I've heard this as well, that a lot of journals actually make money from ads for drugs and reprints about certain articles which may be favorable about the medications. The drug companies will pay them to get 10,000 copies so they can give them to the sales reps and hand them out in medical at medical conferences and offices. And so I think there is just an incentive from the owners of the journals to simply say, well, it's easier for us if we don't publish these things. There's going to be less complications. It's financially, it will be a better fit. I think that's the problem from how I see things. As for a solution, I thought Cochrane was meant to be a solution, which is the organization that you started, but that didn't quite turn out to be the case. Okay, we're just about to talk about Cochrane Collaboration. For some context, this is an international nonprofit of researchers and clinicians that was founded in '93, and its mission was to produce high-quality, independent reviews of medical research so doctors and policymakers could decide on the best evidence. For many years, it was viewed as the gold standard in evidence-based medicine because the reviews were rigorous, transparent, and they were meant to be free from industry bias.
Well, Joseph, I'm very glad that I turned the question to you, because what you just explained was excellent. I couldn't have done it any better myself. You are absolutely correct. And my research group has actually studied how much money that comes from the pharmaceutical industry to the major journals through advertising and selling reprints. It was very difficult to get this information. For example, the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA refused to give us this information. And when we asked the New England Journal, but can't you then just tell us what percentage of your income comes from the drug industry and what percentage from subscribers, for example? They wouldn't tell us. I can tell you that not only me, but other people whom I work with have seen, let's say, the last 10 years, that medical journals and journalism in general, TV and newspapers, they have become more careful not to disturb those who feed them, those who have all the money. TV channels in the States are very dependent on advertising for prescription drugs, which is only allowed in the USA and New Zealand. And we don't allow it in the rest of the world because it's harmful. And I have seen, for example, the British Medical Journal. I consider this the best journal in the world. I was on the editorial board for quite some years at that journal, and I loved it. It was prepared to challenge dogma when I was younger, but this has changed. The British Medical Journal has become very careful not to disturb big financial interests, and they have lawyers that tell them, oh, if Peter Gøtzsche publishes this, you might get sued by this and that drug company. And then BMJ has an obligation to follow the advice of their lawyers. And then after a protracted process that may last 2 years, for example, ultimately my paper gets rejected. And I get quite disturbed by that, because why didn't they tell me right away so I didn't waste 2 years on it? And my colleagues have had exactly the same experiences. So you are very correct there. And when you talk about Cochrane, I was elected to the governing board with the most votes of all 11 candidates, even though I was the only one who dared criticize the Cochrane leadership. But the major funder of Cochrane, the National Health Services research unit, actually warned Cochrane that they should be careful that they did not review garbage. So their reviews became garbage. And Cochrane didn't heed the advice given by the National Health Service and me. And then a couple of years later, Cochrane's major funder disappeared, the UK National Health Service. So Cochrane came in big trouble, and several review groups stopped existing because they didn't have the funding. Now, what I have seen in Cochrane is that it has deteriorated quite rapidly in recent years. For example, I tried to have a protocol accepted by Cochrane for how you can withdraw depression drugs safely. And the editor was very enthusiastic when I suggested this. But when we submitted the protocol, we met an impenetrable wall, you could say. And we were exposed to ridiculous demands that in the background section we should praise the drugs. Praise them. I'm not exaggerating. And write why they were good for people. And this was a review written for people who wanted to come off the drugs. So they didn't think they were so wonderful. So why should we praise them in the background section? It made absolutely no sense. And there were a lot of other silly requirements, and we tried to fulfill all of them, but ultimately our protocol was rejected. And then another research group did a kind of similar review as we had planned to do. And you can read that review today. It is full of undeserved praises for these drugs in the background section. And there are other serious problems with this review. So I could mention many other examples, but I'm one of those who feel it's a big tragedy that Cochrane, that was such a wonderful and idealistic organization in the beginning, it has also succumbed to the forces that tell people that they should be kind to the drug industry, they should be kind to guild interest, to the psychiatrist guild interest, and not worry too much about whether what they publish is honest science. You may think I'm harsh here, but I build it on a lot of data I have studied carefully.
Well, I think that's a really interesting story because you co-founded Cochrane. I think it was in the 90s, and my understanding was it was to keep medicine honest. But how did that mission end with you being expelled from the organization that you actually built?
The unfortunate thing was that in 2012, Cochrane employed a new CEO who was a journalist. Imagine a prestigious scientific organization that appoints a head who is not a scientist but a journalist. In the Canadian Medical Association Journal, there was an editorial that said that eyebrows were raised when people realized that now Cochrane had employed a journalist to lead the whole organization. And this journalist was obsessed with branding Cochrane. He didn't realize that we scientists had already branded Cochrane, so it enjoyed a lot of respect in 2012. So to him, good publicity was far more important than getting the science correct. So he started on a catastrophic Titanic course towards the iceberg, and he had total control of the government board. They were afraid of him. He was very influential and dictatorial in his manners. So I was elected to the governing board in order to change the direction of travel so we would not hit the iceberg. So I became a threat to the CEO. My ideas were totally different to his, and I had a lot of support in Cochrane among those who started the collaboration, including its founder, Sir Ian Chalmers from Oxford. So what happened was that the CEO, whose name is Mark Wilson, he plotted against me. He arranged a show trial against me. And they paid a lot of money to lawyers who were asked to find some dirt on me so that they had an excuse of expelling me because I was threatening his dictatorship. Now, counsel that they employed did not come up with any wrongdoing on my part. He did not think I should be disciplined. So what would any honest organization have done in that situation? They would, of course, have done nothing. But Mark Wilson had given the board an ultimatum. Either you get rid of Peter or you get rid of me. This is not appropriate to do. But the board followed his orders and arranged a show trial I arranged that the whole show trial was recorded, which Cochrane did not want to do, but I ensured it got recorded. So I have written 2 books about this where I document literally how some board members invented false accusations against me, which were absolutely horrible. It was something about bad behavior. And when people ask, what is this bad behavior? We haven't seen Peter displaying bad behavior. They were told, oh, we can't tell you right now, but we may tell you later, and they never said anything. So the whole scientific community was in uproar. There were articles in Science, in Nature, in BMJ, in Lancet, in Le Monde in France. There were articles that were highly critical of Cochrane's actions towards me. And I must say, when I travel around the world and interview people for our film and documentary, for our film channel and interview channel, I constantly hear this, that when Cochrane could expel such a well-respected scientist as me, they lost the confidence they had in Cochrane. So Cochrane scored a huge own goal by living up to the dictator's wishes. That's essentially what happened.
And what was it that you were doing that was so threatening to the CEO and the direction they wanted to take the company, that they would manufacture these accusations of disruptive behavior and put you on a show trial?
I was clearly threatening the CEO's ideas. And I can give you one example. Cochrane had a policy that up to half of the authors of a Cochrane review were allowed to get money directly from the company whose drug they were evaluating. If you ask the general public, would they be happy about this? You know the answer. So when I was elected for the
they want zero. They would want 0 people taking money from the drug companies on the review.
Yes. So when I was elected, I started questioning this and said, we must get a situation where no one, as you say, is allowed to take money from the firms whose products they're evaluating. And I offered to rewrite the commercial sponsorship policy, which I did in an afternoon. It was very quick, but then I was told by the CEO's loyal subordinate, who was co-chair of the governing board and was director of the UK Cochrane Centre. So he was definitely afraid of Mark Wilson. We have documented this. He did what Mark Wilson wanted, and they then launched an investigation among Cochrane people. What do they think about how the policy should be changed? This took Cochrane 2 years. And when they came up with a new policy, it was laughable. Now 1/3 of the authors were allowed to have direct conflicts of interest in relation to the drug industry. When I was interviewed by some UK organization about this, I said, well, this is like if you're cheating on your wife every second day, then one day you tell her, I have now improved. From now on, I will only be unfaithful to you every 3rd day. How do you think the wife would react?
Yeah.
It's incredible. When I tell people this, they look at me in disbelief. Is this really Cochrane? Yes.
Well, something we haven't touched on, which is important to discuss now, is that this is commonplace in academia these days. When I look at the so-called independent experts who are leading our academic institutions, whether it's Harvard or Yale or Stanford, almost all of them are heavily involved in drug company research. I'd be hard pressed to find a leader of any psychiatric program in any major university that isn't heavily involved in drug development in some way. That just seems to be the rule for academic ascension. You work with the drug companies. They help you with your research. They give you the protocols. They help write the papers. You get to use their editorial team to get things published. So they do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. They fly you around the world so you can be a speaker at conferences. You're working with these companies is a fast track to filling your CV with lots of articles and speeches and to really start looking like quite an impressive person. And it's to the point where most of these academics, they're heavily compromised now. And so I could see the people at the Cochrane saying, well, maybe 1/3 is okay, because where are we going to find any academics who aren't compromised now or who aren't working with drug companies? It's become so normal.
You are absolutely right. 4 board members resigned in protest over my expulsion. And one of them said that the Cochrane leaders had told him that if they prohibited authors that got money from the industry, they would have difficulty finding Cochrane reviewers. So that's one of the reasons. You're absolutely right. And in 2013, I published a book with a very blunt title, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. This book became a bestseller, and it has come out in 18 languages and will now come out in Hungarian, even though it's 13 years old. And I mentioned the book because in that book, I describe exactly what you just mentioned, that in America, deans of medical faculties and department chairs often receive sums from the drug industry that are totally obscene, seen with European eyes. They are so big that the corruption is huge. We are not talking about small money here. We are talking about, a corruption that is quite pervasive.
Yeah. And, I was recently revisiting a book, which I think is quite a good one. It's Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre. And there's a chapter right at the end of the book. He talks a lot about pharmaceutical corruption. And he talks about his girlfriend, or an ex-girlfriend of him. They were both in medicine together, and they're discussing, and he's talking about this, about how in awe you are as a junior academic when you start working with the pharmaceutical companies, because all of a sudden you're invited to dinners with all of these academics who, they're all working with the drug companies. They're considered the giants of the field. They're leading the research. They're writing the guidelines. And it's just such a part of that community that you're not going to start criticizing drugs or criticizing the way things are happening, because you finally have a seat at the table to be with the leaders of the space. And if your whole career has been, I want to get ahead in academia, you're going to learn very quickly about the things you can say and the things that you can't say. And you are going to shape your behavior so you can fit in with that group. And it's just so pervasive about how the money from the companies comes down, and it shapes a whole culture of medicine, and the things that you want to say and you can't say, and just through the social parts of it. I really enjoyed that bit of the book because you can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. And I can give you 2 funny examples. I was once the daily leader of the Nordic Coordination Office for AIDS trials. So we were studying new drugs against AIDS. This was in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And I went to Paris for a one-day meeting with a big drug company. And there were people from various countries, and we discussed with the drug company various proposals that we might be interested in doing, financed by the drug company, but provided that we were totally independent, that we would write the protocol, we would do the data analysis, and we would publish without the company having any influence on that. It was very unusual that this particular drug company actually accepted these conditions, which means that they could not manipulate our research. So this will very rarely happen, that you can make a drug company accept this, but they did. And you know, when the day was over, we were invited to a fabulous dinner at Hôtel de l'Opéra in Paris, a very famous place. And the leader from the company, he gave me an envelope after the dinner and said, "Thanks for your contribution today." And I went home and I expected to see some nice words in there, which there were. But there was the biggest money bill I had seen in my whole life, a $1,000 bill. Wow. It was in the envelope. What do I do with the $1,000 bill? I think the guy had already gone home to America. I stood there with $1,000. And then I realized, oh my goodness, they have many subtle ways of making people corrupt. And the other example I will give you, I was in Switzerland, where I met a woman who once worked for a Swiss drug company in Basel. And one day she was given a stack of brown envelopes. So she was going to Denmark, Sweden, and other Nordic countries with these envelopes, and she were going to hand them over to leading physicians in these countries. And then she asked, well, that's an odd assignment. I mean, we have mail, you can post. Why am I going to deliver this personally? And they didn't want to reply, but she was persistent. What's inside these envelopes? Dollar bills. And if she asked more questions, she could find herself another job, which she did. She went into public health.
Wow. So, well, let's segue now, because I want to talk about solutions. I'm gonna do a recap first. And so, we have a situation right now where academics are compromised, medical journals are compromised. The media, and we touched on that briefly. The media, they get a lot of funding from the ads of pharmaceutical companies. They don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. And doctors, because of this, are very poorly informed when it comes to accurate information about the drugs. What is the solution to this? Having seen all of these issues, how do we change things?
Well, the solutions are the hardest part. If we think about public information, there are also problems. For example, I have written a book about vaccines where I document that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, they are praising the influenza vaccine to an extent that not even the drug companies would dare do, because they have claimed on their website that influenza vaccines save lives. This is simply not true, and it's very unlikely to be true, and there are many other problems. So the idea of having publicly, information that comes from public sources might not even be the solution, because, for example, it has been documented that the CDC receives money from the drug industry. They are channeled to the CDC via some mechanism they have, but they are nonetheless partly funded by the drug industry. And you know that the FDA is funded by the drug industry to a large extent. So I I've been active in the European Parliament as a kind of scientific lobbyist, and I succeeded to convince the European drug regulator that I should get access to clinical study reports the drug companies had submitted to them to get their drugs approved. They declined to give me the reports out of commercial confidentiality reasons, and I complained to the ombudsman. And after 3 years, the European drug regulator had to give me the reports. So I opened the archives of the EMA in Europe, and I became quite popular in some parties in Parliament, and I went there and worked on legislation to create even more access to data at the drug regulator, which we succeeded creating. So the EMA became far ahead of the FDA in terms of openness about the material they have. And that was because of what I did 15 years ago, or it actually started 18 years ago. So this is my biggest achievement in my whole academic career. And as part of that, I worked with several politicians.
Now, just because that is such a big achievement, I want to try and explain that. So most people don't understand that what the public sees in medical journals are usually just summaries of data that a drug company has given a medical journal. When you actually get a clinical study report, this is something a drug company gives like the FDA or the European regulator, where it has all of the data from the studies. And that actually allows you and other scientists to do independent analyses. And that's why getting clinical study reports is such a big deal. And it's why drug companies, they don't want to publish them. Is that correct, Peter?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
It is very correct. And okay. We use this access to the clinical study reports, which can take up thousands of pages for just one trial, to show how dangerous antidepressants are, that there are many more cases of suicidality, of suicide attempts and suicidal thoughts and so on, than what gets published in the medical journals. And we also found examples of violence, thoughts about homicide and things like that don't get published. Now, I am an expert witness in lawsuits against Merck's HPV vaccine that is called Gardasil. That is in America. And as an expert, I have been able to read 112,000 pages of internal study reports Merck has produced on Gardasil. This corresponds to 500 books. And of course, I didn't read every single page because some pages were about laboratory values. But I published a book this week, a few days ago, about how Merck and drug regulators have hidden serious neurological harms of the HPV vaccines, which you have heard about for many years, but which the authorities have refused exist. This is not true. I could see how Merck had deliberately, I write in the book that I believe Merck has committed fraud by not alerting not even the drug regulators to serious neurological harms. We have examples of this. So this tells you once again that if you want to know what drugs do to people, don't go to the medical journals. You need to go to the sources, the clinical study reports. And may I give you an example from Psychiatry about this?
Yes.
We had access to the study reports Eli Lilly had produced on fluoxetine called Prozac in America, which was praised as a wonder drug when it came on the market. It is anything but a wonder drug. So with psychiatrist David Healy, I went through these study reports of some 1,000 pages, and then I could see that, for example, 2 suicide attempts, and we are talking about children. These reports were about fluoxetine in depressed children. And in one of the trials, 2 suicide attempts on fluoxetine had been left out of the publication, but we could see it in the clinical study report. So the mantra for the drug industry, as you said early on in this conversation, is that the drug is effective and safe. So this is what the drug industry always says, and also drug regulators. So David Healy and I wrote an article where our conclusion was fluoxetine is unsafe and ineffective, because that's what we found.
Wow. I think, when we look at solutions to this isso, I was reflecting on that as I asked you, and there has to be some regulation. This problem is so big. The medical journals, the people, the peer reviewers, they shouldn't take money from drug companies. Medical journals shouldn't be taking money from drug companies if they're publishing. Academics, the people leading the academic institutions and training the next generation of doctors, their teachers shouldn't be taking money from drug companies. And I also think, we have to have some kind of regulation at a government level that actually protects against censorship, such as, when different doctors, they want to talk about problems with vaccines, or they want to talk about problems with drugs. Right now on social media and different places, these videos are being removed. People are being punished by their academic institutions. They're being attacked by their medical boards. And so even free speech about these medications is being challenged right now. It's grim when I reflect on what the solutions would have to be to solve this problem.
Well, let me give you a few hints. In June, I was in Washington, D.C., where I met with you, actually, and your wife. And we attended a meeting on veteran suicides that the suicide prevention program in the United States involves to give people antidepressants. And when the veterans that were war traumatized got antidepressants on a larger scale, the suicides went up, which would be expected because this is what the drugs do to people. So I gave a lecture about this in Capitol when I was there. And I also had the pleasure of interviewing Jay Bhattacharya, the new director of the National Institutes of Health. And I had a planned meeting with Bob Kennedy, your health secretary, but unfortunately he had an emergency. So I just went to him and spoke very briefly with him. But I've also interviewed Martin Kulldorff twice, who was one of the three authors, together with Jay Bhattacharya, of the Great Barrington Declaration that told us that we should not lock down our societies because it would be very harmful. And Jay and Martin have been absolutely correct, because Sweden was the only country in the world that didn't lock down. And they have had a lower mortality overall in the population during the COVID pandemic than other countries, because when you lock down, you increased mortality from other reasons. Some people with pain in their chest didn't dare go to the hospital because they were afraid of getting COVID infected. And then they died from their heart attack at home. That's just one example. So I would like to say that what I see in America right now, I have never seen anything like it before. Kennedy knows that I disagree with him about some opinions on vaccines he has, but I also agree with him that it is very wrong that new vaccines are not tested against a placebo, but against another vaccine that might have similar harms as the vaccine you are testing, which means that then you won't find out which harms your new vaccine has when you don't have a placebo control. That's just one of Bob's. things. And as you know, he has kicked out the whole CDC Vaccine Advisory Committee and has employed a new one where Martin Kulldorff is sitting and other good people. So the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee is now no longer corrupt, because those who sat there before, they had ties to the drug industry. This is not acceptable. So what I see right now in America gives me some hope for the future.
Mm-hmm. We certainly are at a very interesting moment in time in the US when it comes to awareness about these issues, and I do hope it continues. Well, Peter, on that note, I'd like to wrap. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me and my audience.
Thank you, Joseph.
If you like this video, you're not going to want to miss this one over here.